Hi, Kyle Sword with NSG Pilkington, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a little bit of the history of vehicle glass glazing in the Toledo area and how our company, Libby Owens Ford, was connected with the Jeep name brand and the Jeep company foundings. So many of you may be aware that Toledo is known as the Glass City, and really the three founders of our company, Libby, Owens, and Ford, created dozens of companies that spun off into even dozens more companies. The history of innovation and development in this area is really rich, and it's really interesting to learn as much as we can about how it's impacted the automotive industry, as well as dozens of other industries. So I'll be sharing a little bit of that with you today. So if you're interested in learning more about this, three available resources that you could probably find at any of the local libraries. The Glassmakers from Pilkington was a really good one. Fire and Sand is another excellent one, and the Roots Grow Deep all do a really nice job documenting some of the Toledo history and some of the developments of LOF and Pilkington that were relevant to this investigation. Getting made here in Toledo, we made glass with what's called the plate glass process. Now, what you see here was actually filmed in, I think it was 1926, with what's called the Beechroot process. So this is a little bit more developed than the original plate glass casting was, but you get the gist of it. But which is essentially what you're doing is you're taking a vat of molten glass, you're pouring it out, and then you make it into a big sheet. But then you've got to then polish that down. So for automotive, this was interesting because with the development, of the automobile, this is what they started using. Plate glass was imported from Europe in the 1830s, 1850s, and we started making it here in the U.S. in the 1860s, like early 70s. Toledo, we started making it in 1898. One of the three key elements in skyscraper design, so you have to have elevators, air conditioning, and polished plate glass to withstand wind loads at high elevation. So that was the main reason for bringing it in. But when the automobile came about and they wanted to have the closed automobile, you gotta have some sort of glass or glazing you can see through. So they started with polished plate glass. The problem with that is it's not very safe, and when you get into an accident, you can get damaged, from people, from flying glass, and then from you impacting the glass as well. So almost as early as plate glass has been around, you started seeing people that got interested in developing safer glass due to safety issues. One of the early developments on this I thought was really interesting. I was doing some research where it was about the Columbian Exposition, which, Libby, if you're a Toledo buff, you may know that Libby went and built an active glass manufacturing plant to make tableware, glasses and bottles and things like that at the Columbian Expo. Wild, spent $250,000 of his own money to go out and develop this. Super cool. But one of the other interesting things was they built what was called the Crystal Palace. And this is referenced in a really good book it's a kind of a combination book about the Columbian Expo and actually a serial killer who people think may have been Jack the Ripper, from a guy named Gary Larson. So it's called Devil in the White City. Great book. But this Crystal Palace was this really large all glass building. But one of the things that was interesting for that was if you came across on a cold Chicago morning and it was a really chilly morning, it was a bright sunny day, they said you were taking your life in your own hands if you walked anywhere near the Crystal Palace, because what would happen is the sun would hit on that glass building and the glass would shatter under thermal stress. So you would be like raining shards of glass underneath you. So what they did was they started putting chicken wire up underneath these big overhangings and stuff like that to catch the glass as it fell in. Well, that then led to wire glass. So wire glass developed in the 1890s-ish sometime, where you actually just made the glass into the wire, but then that no longer counts as a safety rated product either, because what happens is the thermal expansion mismatch between glass and metal means that the glass breaks, during thermal cycling, and then those still are pretty sharp shards of glass and that can still fall out. So it doesn't really help you safety wise. Tempered glass came along. I don't have great date on this, but use of tempered glass seemed to be pretty evident between the 1920s to the 1900s to the 1920s. And then really the first automotive laminated glass in the US started coming out in 1926 and 1928. And that was all developed by LOF. In Europe, it was, I think, more like 1908 or something like that, with a company called Toughflex. But in the US, LOF was the founder and the developer of laminated safety glass in the US. So some pretty interesting developments around safety, I think. So the car industry was, you can see these two videos that are going to play. Originally they're windshields and side lights and all the glass that was in a closed vehicle and an open vehicle as well. were all just plate glass, polished plate glass that was just annealed and it cut into big shards. And you can see that the development of the laminated windshield was a really, really big innovation. And it's actually that reason that LOF was awarded sole supply of GM vehicles. And I think one of the first vehicles that came out with laminated plate glass as a standard product was in a 1928 Model A. Um, but GM then rolled out 100% laminated windshields, and LOF was a sole source of them from 1931 to like 1961 or something like that. Like a 30-year period, they sole sourced the entire vehicles. So I never saw any of these processes myself, and I've not talked to anybody who actually worked in any of these sites that I've gotten great detail out of. So there's probably still some people around the Toledo area that could really give me some of this info. But 1926 is when laminated glass came out. In Toledo, we started really ramping this up in 1928. But it's very different from the way laminated glass is today. So today, we take PVB, we stick it in between two pieces of glass, you de-air it, like pinch roll it or vacuum bag it or something like that, and then you put it into an autoclave, which is basically like a big pressure cooker. You cook it at time temperature, under pressure, it kind of gets all the bubbles out and it turns the PVB into a clear plastic. What we did back in the day was these were all like underground oil vats. So, I mean, it really was kind of like pressure cooking chicken. That you would put these big vats of windshields that are in these metal racks down into this vat and pressure cook it. And the East Toledo plant was one of the largest lamination plants, at least according to all the historical documents that I can find. But this is how laminated glass was developed and rolled out throughout the U.S. was out of this site in Toledo. The other thing I thought was really fascinating is if you look through all of our history, LOF was no different than a lot of other companies at this time frame, which is, during World War II, companies are expected to help the war effort. And so a lot of men went off to war, a lot of women came into the factories and started working, and we really made a ton of different products. And the innovation that came out of this space, led to hundreds of other innovations and led to dozens of other industries. But if you look, we made all the glazings that went into the vehicles and cars. We made glazing transparencies that went into planes and aircrafts. These are the cockpit covers. These are the big carriers, the gunner areas, all those sort of things. But we also made laminated bulletproof glass. We made optical sight lines. We made glass-lined fuel tanks so that you didn't have spark issues. We made little mirrors that you would give to the people that were on the planes. That way, if their plane went down, they could signal for other planes that are going by. We made tempered glass that went into these big spotlights, optical pieces that went into rifle scopes, heated glazing that went into electronics vehicles, and then even sight gauges that went into tanks. And so really, dozens and dozens of different glass technologies all came out of LOF. And the vast majority of that came out of the Toledo area. So really, World War II was a massive innovation point for the city and for the glass industry as well as for our company. So there's another local author, Barbara Floyd. She's written a couple great books around the history of Toledo, not just about glass, but about the city of Toledo in general. And she was the head archivist at the University of Toledo Kennedy Center, which again is an open to the public, just an outstanding resource that has a lot of this great information. But some of the articles that I found in there was one that was from what was called the LOF Classic, which was like a magazine publication that the company would put out. But there was some really interesting information that I found in here. There was a guy named John Biggers, who was the company president for a while. And during World War II, he got moved into what's called the Office of Production Management, or OPM. And so the OPM was essentially think about all the different industries that might feed materials to the U.S. government for manufacturing. He was on that board essentially that said, well, where should we do stuff? How should we do it? Are we on pace to make the amount of things that we need? Really, really, impressive position. And that's how important LOF was at the time, not just to the company, but to national security. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that happened at that time that was really interesting. One of the things that was really cool was the OPM says, hey, we're making these new Jeep vehicles, and we want LOF to make these windshields. And John Biggers says, well, I'm looking at LOF's manufacturing and our capabilities, and we're making all these big trucks for GM, and we're doing this, we really can't fit in all this additional capacity. So he was one of the guys that then suggested, Well, there's this other company that's starting up, which is Willys Overland Motors Inc. In 1936 they reorganized, and then in 1940 they ended up winning this military contract. And a lot of it is actually due directly to LOF's president, John Biggers, saying, "Hey, these would be a good company. Talk to these guys; they can make this part." Really, that's what led to Willys Overland getting the Jeep contract and actually becoming what they are today as with Jeep. It was all related to our company. And there's a friend of mine, Milton Knight, or he's known as Tony Knight. He provided me with this chart that shows here. If you want to read it and understand all of it, I highly suggest you to hit pause and screenshot it because there's loads of information here. But really, what this does a very nice job of showing you that there's all this overlap in Toledo at that time between LOF, Willys Overland, Owens Bottle Company, all these different companies and people had all these interconnected relationships that really drove a lot of the development, not just for the war effort, but just for business development in Toledo at the time. So really some interesting information that came out of Tony here. So again, highly recommend you to look into some of this information and find out some more. And then there were another two other books that I found in our archives internally. One was this book called Facts of the Victory Year, and this was put up by Libby Owens Ford in 1945. And there was another one called Facts About Libby Owens Ford. And both of these had some really interesting data and pictures I thought that were really cool. The best I could tell is because we had so many government contracts, at the end of the war, the government says, well, LOF, you guys better show me what you did to earn all that money that we gave and, all the stuff that we bought. You better document some of the stuff that you did. So really some great information that came out of these with some great pictures of the different Jeeps and the trucks that we did all the glazings for World War II. But really this was a wealth of information and knowledge when it came down to trying to understand and learn about some of that manufacturing history between LOF and Jeep. So some really fantastic data here in these two books, Facts About the History, Facts About LOF, and Facts About the Victory Year. But really went into some great detail around the glazing components themselves. And so for World War II, LOF manufactured over 2.5 million pieces of glass that were just glazing components for vehicles that went into the war. I would say overall, we supplied more than 2/3 of the World War II truck programs. More than two-thirds of the actual glazings that went into all the vehicles for all of the U.S. Came out of LOF and mostly came out of Toledo. We supplied 100% of the Willys demand for the local Willys Overland manufacturing. We did 100% of that class, which was about 72% of the overall Jeep vehicles that were supplied into World War II. And then we also supplied 100% of the GM vehicles during World War II, which was more than about 460,000 of these heavy trucks that got supplied. And so really, LOF in the Toledo area were just a massive, massive supplier of glass and glazing components that went into the vehicles that got used throughout World War II, everywhere that vehicles were used during World War II. So it was really impressive to understand that we are that important of a piece in history. And even today, NSG Pilkington still takes a lot of that innovation and development that we learned and kind of became some of our DNA and our culture. We still take those innovative ideas and we use those today to continue to push new technology and developments. So as you look at vehicles today, they're very different than they were in the 1940s and the 1920s. But glazing components are getting bigger. People want to see out vehicles more. We're developing roof lights that have multiple capabilities, these big panoramic roof lights. A lot of heat can penetrate through those, so we have different mechanisms that we use to help drive down that. There's switchable materials that you can put in there. There's low EV materials that you can put in there. Loads of new innovations that are coming out in that space. As windows get more complicated, and especially as you put things in like camera systems and crash detection and all these sort of things, that windshield then becomes very complicated. And making sure that the camera is calibrated to properly identify what things are that are outside the vehicles. Think of self-driving vehicles. All the cameras that are behind there, you've got to make sure work properly. And so there's loads of technology that actually goes into the glazing component. In the RV market, there are companies that say, well, we want big RV windows and we want them to perform pretty well, but we also want privacy. So we developed a reflective product specifically for the RV market to deal with their needs. Those are things that are happening today, and brand new innovations, brand new needs, new demands. We're on the forefront of developing the technologies that companies and consumers are asking for. And so, for instance, the bus that's on the right-hand side, we've got a coating now that we can develop, or we have developed, that's commercially available, that goes on the inside of the vehicle. As the sun charges that coating, the coating actually starts to break down any sort of foreign materials that are on it. So this could be dirt and dust. It can also be germs and microbes. So it can be things like, when somebody's got a cold and they cough onto that, it actually kills the viruses and stuff that are on the surface. It also actually does a nice job of reducing things like ozone and VOC. So it actually cleans the air as you're moving around and driving. So there's loads and loads of new innovations that are coming out all the time. This can be with glass, this can be with coatings, and it can be with processing. So we're at the forefront of all that. We have been for over 125 years here in Toledo, and we're positioned to be here for another 125 years. Again, lots of developments, lots of innovations. We want to be the ones that are out pushing these new technologies. It was really fun just learning about all the history between our company and Jeep, and seeing how we can maybe potentially leverage ideas and technology that we've picked up from the past, because a lot of time that's a good predictor of the future. So, but that was it. I hope this was interesting for you, and thanks again for listening.